Hello, everybody, and wherever you are in the world, welcome to our online conference, Eco-Translation, responding to the work of Michael Cronin. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, which is organising the event. Founded in 1989 by my predecessor, the distinguished German language novelist W.G. Sebald, BCLT is based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. At BCLT, we've been promoting literary translation for over 30 years, overseeing master's and doctoral training programs at the university, running a variety of events supporting the literary translation profession, such as our annual summer school and the public Sebald lecture, and engaging in literary translation related research, with an online research seminar series and periodic, more substantial events, such as this one. We're delighted to be hosting this event devoted to the work of one of the most important translation theorists of our time, and equally delighted with the level of interest already shown in the event, with no fewer than 800 pre-registrations. The event is focused on the work of our keynote speaker later this afternoon, Irish translation theorist Michael Cronin. Michael Cronin has always been an agenda setter since he first came to prominence in the mid-1990s with his study Translating Ireland, Translation, Languages, Cultures. Over an extensive and highly versatile output since then, he's remained firmly at the forefront of translation studies research. This conference focuses on issues highlighted in Cronin's recent work, in particular Eco-Translation, Translation and Ecology in the Age of the Anthropocene, published by Routledge in 2017. Cronin's book explores the challenges to translation posed by human-induced environmental change, with topics ranging from the translation of travel literature to endangered languages and interspecies communication. Our conference will consider themes raised by this book and also Michael's more recent work, including the short bilingual study Irish and Ecology from 2019 and other strands from his earlier research. It's a tribute to Michael's standing in the field and the urgency of the questions that his work is addressing that we've been able to assemble such a distinguished lineup of speakers for this event. I should say that the conference was originally scheduled for this time last year, but had to be postponed. So we're particularly grateful that all the speakers were able to reconfirm their participation at this time. We're using the Zoom webinar platform for our event, so let me say a few words now about that. We've enabled both Q&A and chat functions, so you should see buttons for both on your screens. After each presentation has finished, we'll have the remaining time in the session available for audience questions to the speaker. Please use the Q&A function for any questions that you would like me to put to the speaker. Please also upvote any questions that you would particularly like to see addressed so that they will rise to the top of the list and stand the best chance of being addressed in the time available. You can ask the speaker a question using the Q&A function anytime during the session, not just at the end. Please also feel free to use the chat function for any other conversations, sharing links, and so on. I'll immediately share the conference program in the chat myself. The order of speakers this afternoon is Federico Federici, followed by Loredana Polezzi. Then, after a mid-afternoon break of half an hour or so, we'll hear from Carolyn Shred, before concluding today's proceedings with a mid-conference keynote presentation from Michael Cronin. We plan to run to time as far as possible, but with online events, you never know what glitches might lie in store, so please bear with us if there should be any technical mishaps. The event runs over 2 days, and we've set up separate joining links for today and tomorrow, but in each case, just one link for the whole day. We're recording the sessions, and those videos will be available on the BCLT YouTube channel later this month. One final point before I introduce our first speaker. Michael's publisher, Routledge, has prepared a flyer with reductions on eco-translation itself and further Routledge titles of relevance. And I'll share that in the chat now as well. Let's begin. Our first speaker, Federico Federici, is Professor of Intercultural Crisis Communication at the Centre for Translation Studies, University College London. He holds a laurea in foreign languages from Rome La Sapienza University and a PhD in translation from the University of Leeds in the UK. He founded and directed the Centre for Intercultural Mediation at Durham University, where he worked from 2006 till 2014. His research focuses on translators and interpreters as intercultural mediators, on online translated news, and the study of translation in crises. He authored Translation as Stylistic Evolution, published in 2009, and since then he has edited and co-edited various books bearing on translating regionalized voices, translators, interpreters, and cultural negotiators, and the role of translation in crises, including the 2019 Routledge volume, Translation in Cascading Crises, co-edited with Sharon O'Brien. His volume, Intercultural Crisis Communication, Translation, Interpreting, and Languages in Local Crises, co-edited with Christophe de Clercq, is coming out from Bloomsbury next week. Federico's title today is Translating Natural Hazards, Climate Change, Risk, and Translation. Federico, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks very much to the audience for participating to this event. I'm hoping, Duncan, that the screen is showing my shared slides.
It is.
And therefore I can comment. So I'm delighted to be involved in this celebration of echo translation, a volume that has a particular meaning for me. And you will notice that in my talk, my reading of Professor Cronin's echo translation has taken me over the years to a rather different route than when I first read it. And I first read it after listening to a talk he gave in Wellington, New Zealand in 2017. I happened to be there at the beginning of a project, the Interactive Crisis Translation project, coordinated by Professor Sharon O'Brien. And during that talk, maybe the beginning of what is a chain reaction of ideas started. And perhaps my observations today are more a thank you to Professor Cronin for the chain reactions that his writing inspired than a traditional response. I will not be dealing with literary translations, but I believe that literary translation has a lot to contribute to the kind of work that I am going to introduce to you. And I think also that both interpreting and misinterpreting some of eco translation have a role to play in what you will hear from me today. Interpreting and misinterpreting, it's a chosen idea here. I will start by giving you a sense of what it is, a talk that follows 4 overlapping themes. And depending on times, I'm hoping to give you also an illustration of where I think translation and interpreting scholarship can have a substantial impact in advocating plurality of voices and social equality in relation to translation of hazards, translation of risks. But I have to add a very short caveat. If you like order talks, my with a strongly connected and very clear argument, then today you have to brace yourself for a bumpy ride, because a lot of what I'm saying is still in an evolutionary mode. But you can see that my idea is to start by discussing the notion of hazards that I'm referring to. I'm moving from that idea towards a definition that is crucial to discussing hazards and discussing the ways in which natural hazards are connected with climate change are changing inexorably the planet that we live on. And that notion is a notion of perception of risks, how we perceive risks, how we react to risks. And therefore, when we know and perceive risks, what happens? What kind of actions do we take? What kind of activities do we follow to reduce the risk? And I would like to then move to a fourth theme, that is the theme of appropriacy or appropriateness of translation in relation to translating hazards. How do we translate scientific research in a way that is accessible to a population at risks of multiple hazards, but also how do we listen? How do we understand? How do we engage with information, cultural, and theoretical, philosophical epistemologies that are completely different from ours? And ultimately, I'm hoping to give you a short example of what that does to my own research. So when we look at hazards, immediately we think about natural hazards. And indeed, the discussion of natural hazards is bound to increase exponentially unless we're going to act very seriously to reduce the impact of climate change on our planet. But also the notion of hazards is varied, is plural, is in itself a notion that has been negotiated significantly across political and cultural divides and continues to be renegotiated all the time. It is true, though, that in terms of facts, in terms of what we're seeing, in terms of the endless raining season in the spring this year in the UK, the climate is changing. It's changing inexorably. So what does it mean? It means that hurricanes, cyclones, typhoons are changing in intensity, but also in numbers. Other events are changing and continuously increasing the level of risk. So when we're looking at hazards, however, I want to be sure that I give you the position where I come from, which is a position that is not legitimized by the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Unit as such, but it is harmonized in a definition that is itself the result of a compromise, of negotiations, of mediations, of discussions that happened with multiple interpreters and with point of view that came from different languages. But it is a definition that dictates what we can say now about hazards. And it is relevant that when we discuss translating hazards, we consider how much of a priority they are for any translator and interpreting researchers in the 21st century. It is clearly the #1 priority within the area of crisis translation, in which I have been spending quite a few years now, but it is also a challenge. They are a challenge not only because of what they are. Hazards, as you can see from the definition on the screen, may be natural, anthropogenic, social, natural in origin. So they can be natural or anthropogenic, meaning that they're human-induced hazards. But many other hazards are social natural, meaning that the anthropogenic factors, the human-made hazard has triggered a reaction that then causes a disaster, a crisis, an emergency to which we have to deal. And that is why they are a challenge for me. I think that translation interpreting is challenged to advocate, to speak for concerted, collaborative, and disruptive activities to ensure that the voices of indigenous people, the voices of culturally and linguistically, the voices of culturally and linguistically diverse minorities, as well as the voices of marginalized groups and the voices of the global South, become central in any application of eco-translation principles. So in a way, Cronin asks us to pay attention, and I've been paying attention. I've been paying attention to a range of concerns that are connecting regularly an hazard of any nature with what happens to us in our ordinary life. And there is a connection there between 4 areas that are very important, and it is not the case of continuing to define terminologies, even though you find that in terms of research around disasters, there's approximately, I think, 195 definitions by now, just of disaster alone. But I think the key terms that I'm using here, hazards, emergency, disasters, and crisis, are important to define the argument I want to put forward today. These debates are, of course, highly politicized. So every terminological choice is the result of multiple agendas that are often in collision, and they put in collision routes researchers, funding bodies, political agendas, as well as environmental activists, scientists, negationists, industries. So they're not points of agreement. They're not necessarily a point of automatic agreement. And in fact, you find that one expression that I will not use in my talk, natural disaster, continues to be used by journalists worldwide. And especially in the USA and in British media, natural disasters continues to be a collocation regularly used. And we should abhor that collocation. We should despise it. Because for every research area connected with climate change, we realize that not only those tensions are there, but we also realize that no disaster is a natural disaster. We can study them through the lenses of natural, mathematical, soft, social sciences, or translation and interpreting studies. But ultimately, we need all of human knowledge to engage with the big questions, the grand challenges of our century. And so I don't want to go into the debates, but I want to make sure that once we know that an hazard is a process, a phenomenon, a human activity that causes loss of life, injury or other health impacts, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation, the next thing that we know is that there's going to be at some point an emergency out of one of those hazards triggering an event to which we have to respond. And that is what an emergency is. And I'm using David Alexander definition. He's a professor of disaster risk reduction at the University College London. And his expertise has been for 4 decades in training crisis managers. And he has a good understanding of what it means working in multilingual context with crisis managers who never consider translation or interpreting as part of their endeavor until they need to face the response to an emergency. And an emergency is an out of the ordinary situation that must be managed by urgent procedures in order to stop it escalating and thus having consequences that are more serious and damaging for the rest of the population. Emergencies require timely response and a high degree of organization by a number of people within a society. And those responses are then defined by size, by shape, by impact. And in that setting, a crisis is a sudden intrusive interruption of normal conditions with potentially adverse consequences. So that's why we need a plan. That's why we need a plan, because adverse conditions happen unexpectedly. A pandemic appeared out of nowhere, apparently. So there are emergency plans. And my interest has been with emergency plans for quite some time, because hazards trigger disasters, and disasters are dealt with by having a good plan to manage them. Now, in 2013, I used to work at Durham University, and there were a range of floods that affected my departments. And an entire academic year, we were evacuated and working in completely odd conditions that must have prepared my colleagues who still work there for the pandemic. But those conditions meant we had to abandon our offices, and regularly we had to evacuate our buildings because the river tends to flood. Fast forward 7 years, and the picture I put here on the screen is from Durham from February 2020, when Storm Dennis affected the riverside banks. So just 7 years after we kept doing evacuations, what do we see there? A building site next by the river, and those houses will be sold and people will buy those houses. So the natural hazard, the river flooding, is connected with the notion of vulnerability. Those houses are going to be vulnerable to flooding, we know. But is it the flooding that causes the loss of property and puts at risk the lives of those who are going to live in those properties? Or is it, as Kelman says, human choices that cause disasters? So human choices can prevent disasters. And we already have the knowledge, understanding, theory, and examples to show that we can triumph over ourselves. So when we have the wisdom to do what we know needs to be done everywhere, learning for those who have succeeded. Now, Kelman's book is a fantastic book for disseminating the idea that disaster is by choice, meaning we have to take responsibility as a species, that this age is the age of the ultimate crisis. And with that crisis, we need to deal with the diversity of impact, but also we need to understand it from a diverse point of view of those of us who are going to be affected. And in many cases, those of us who are going to be affected are indigenous people, minority groups that are more vulnerable, more exposed to the risks of being affected by an hazard. So those are the key terms that we looked at so far: natural hazards, but also let's remember that human hazards. So we have biochemical hazards, we have technological hazards as well, that are considered in a broader definition by the United Disaster Risk Reduction Office. But also we have encountered in some of my words, the notion of vulnerability. And this is one that is pivotal for me in the connection between Professor Cronin's work on eco-translation and many of the notions that come with trying to speak to communities that are minoritized, marginalized, and try to listen to their needs and their voices. Because this principle of vulnerability is a principle that is often connected with socioeconomic factors, but also it was and has lost its traditional idea of a radical paradigm to move away from the idea that with disasters, not only you need an emergency plan, but you need a very specific actions and a set of actions that work in a technocratic way to resolve the problems of the people affected by the disasters, so that the victims, and this term is no longer used, that's why I used the horrendous air quotes, sorry, but that term is no longer used, but the idea that disasters caused victims rather than affected populations was linked to the idea that the disaster is something that happens outside the human sphere. It's something that affects humans, but we are not responsible, we're not part of it. And in the 1970s and the late 1960s, there was a huge change in perspective that's introduced this notion of vulnerability, which we can then connect, and this happened early in the 1980s in human geography, with the idea that different cultures perceive risks differently. And less so in disaster risk reduction, there's been an awareness that disaster also affects the perception of risk. Now, when a hazard happens and changes the ordinary living of people, the cascading consequences of the disasters are at the heart of a large population, a small population, a small village, a large region. But what happens is that often it causes that population, however big or small it is, to change its way of living for good, forever. And I think that is an important point to consider because it links very strongly climate change and the need to look for resources and opportunities elsewhere with people's displacement. People displacement internally and then internationally, the issue of migration, as has been considered by some politicians, are often connected with the impact of an hazard that destroys the way of living of an entire group of people, however big or small that is. But we don't often listen to their experience. And these are some words by Michael Cronin that really resonated with me when I was looking at this aspect of the impact of disasters on migrant populations and the impact of disasters on people already vulnerable because exposed socioeconomically to the impact of a sudden and unprecedented change of way of life. And as Cronin says, for indigenous people to tell their stories, whether of ancestral lore around place and political narratives about exploitation, it is crucial that they have access to the resources of translation. Now, without translation, without a way of making their voices heard, they're silenced. And that is often the case, and that continues to be the case. And that silence is taken from one place to another. That silence is taken with the displacement of people. So a population had to be evacuated from the Buzi district in Mozambique by the aftermath of the cyclone Idai in March 2019, tried to return to their houses and their properties, only to find that on the 26th of January this year, another cyclone affected the same district with very similar results. So places become places of absence, places of the past, places where people take their languages, their culture, their law with them, but they don't take the language, or they have to leave a lot of the linguistic background behind. And this is obvious for most of us, is obvious for the politicians who don't act on this, that hazards are going to have an impact on those countries that have reduced capacity to rebuild, to recover, and to reconstruct after an hazard. It's not just economic capacity, but it's also social capacity. Having people that are aging in a village that is affected by a natural disaster means that that village will never be repopulated, means that the community was already on its way out and is another community that we are going to lose. But also what we should learn is that community-driven risk preparedness has proven to be phenomenally efficient when it is being studied appropriately. But we don't know enough. The populations that are successful often speak rare languages in terms of translation. They use rare language combinations in terms of commercial translation and interpreting services. And often they are groups of people that belong to endangered language groups, but they're not really endangered. They're endangered by the perspective of those who don't speak the language. And that is often the outsiders that carry out research and cannot listen. Which takes me to some points that J.C. Gaillard, a disaster risk reduction specialist, made. And he made some points about the use of vulnerability as a concept to hide a continued hegemony of lingua franca, of the international languages, over the languages of populations that may be using minority or indigenous languages, or languages that simply often are spoken by a very large number of people, but they have different traditions. They're not written down. They're not written down in the same way. And they lack a transliteration system. They lack an harmonized alphabet. But those languages are still very much alive and spoken. But we cannot study them if we don't consider the role of an interpreter, of a translator, as crucial to carry out research in an area at risk from an hazard. Now, areas at risk are multiple and diverse, but also the ways in which we deal with risk, as I said, are often cultural. And that is the point that I want to make. Risk perception is a cultural perception. Risk depends on how individuals, as a member of a family, as a member of a region, as a member of a geographical area, as members of times of an ethnic group, identify and recognize risks to themselves, their loved ones. So this picture was printed on the in the Huffington Post in December 2015. and is just an eyeboat tour around the volcano of Stromboli in southern Italy. When this group of tourists was going around the island, the volcano erupted. Why do we have nighttime boat tour around the volcano that is very much active? That is because we perceive risk differently. Is that an Italian thing? Is that a question of how we deal with risks as a society? It is a combination of all of those. When we look at risk, the simplest definitions is that we have to consider them against two ideas. A risk is something that affects our safety or our security. Safety means that we need protection from accidental harm. So a geological or geophysical hazard, like a volcano or an earthquake, is a risk to our safety, but also technological hazards, electricity going down, power cuts, blackouts that may leave us in the middle of a dangerous action without the light at night, or biological hazards, mutation in a virus. Those are accidental. It doesn't mean that somebody is not responsible for increasing the vulnerability to those hazards, but themselves as risk, they are accidental. So when we look at risk in terms of security, it means we look at risk against protection from intentional harm. So cyber attacks, organized crime, conflict, terrorism, and so on. So a human-made as well as intentional hazard. So what would you say if I were to suggest that lack of activism, lack of a strong environmental agenda to stop climate change is a risk to security, because we're failing to act against intentional harm from industries, politicians, and negationists who are refusing to engage with the crisis of our century? Would it be acceptable? It could be just a provocation. You don't necessarily want to engage with that. We might want to engage with that. I'd be very happy to have questions on that point. But what is very clear in terms of disaster risk reduction, and my take as a transition specialist on it, is that there was in the 1980s, when the paradigm of vulnerability was still developing, suddenly the recognition that risk is part of public perception. So as Douglas and Wildavsky put in a very influential paper, the public perception of risk and its acceptable levels are collective constructs, a bit like language and a bit like aesthetic judgment. Now, it's fascinating here that they got so close to accept that language itself, not just culture, and the ways in which language creates social interactions among its speakers and among multiple languages, and especially the interactions of those translanguaging between indigenous and marginal languages and lingua francas, are actually pivotal for our real understanding of the complexity of crisis. And psycholinguists agree. They say that there's a lot of difference in the ways in which languages allow us to perceive risk. So there's both a cultural and a linguistic element on our perception of language. But in terms of disaster risk reduction, languages have not been considered, not even just within the umbrella of culture. And Wisner, one of those who made the change towards opening up the field to considering the complexity of all of the different elements, including those that are there to define vulnerability, states that there is a cultural politics element that is always important when we try to assess the way in which an hazard triggers or creates the potential for a risk and an emergency, and the ways in which the local population and their needs are considered in relation to the hazard, in relation to the response to the emergency. So the cultural politics and the local cultural politics, if we were to analyze this sentence in terms of a textual analysis, we can see that this is the typical sentence of somebody from the outside looking in. And that, unfortunately, has often been the case with a lot of the research that happens around vulnerability. And in fact, Wisner was a very prominent researcher in this area, and is an incredibly sharp mind in understanding sociological and cultural dimensions, pointed out that from the very beginning, the English word vulnerability turns out to be difficult to translate into many languages. Even when a term is found, inevitably a good deal is lost in translation. Now, for many years in which I was looking through disaster risk reduction literature, this was one of the few explicit mentions of the notion of translation. And you can see it's pretty recent. But also, vulnerability in English indicates a form of resiliency. Not only that, but I want to focus in particular to the idea that McCoy carries over from classical studies. Vulnerable is the hero who's still brave and will run towards the adversity. Vulnerable is somebody who doesn't have a weakness, an inherent or temporary weakness, but is somebody who is suddenly put in a position of disadvantage. And just like the hero, a character on the stage of life, it's temporarily vulnerable. And that level of temporality is moved by using McCoy's words into being considered part of the human condition. We are concerned with living as temporal creatures who undergo change and transformation of various sorts, and who live in the awareness of the likelihood of change. So in theory, that vulnerability, that fact that it's a temporary element of the human condition, we are vulnerable at different times for different reasons, should make us resilient when our way of life changes so substantially. But the reality is that however much we might like that collocation of vulnerability, the English language in which a lot of the research on disaster risk reduction and disaster research is produced shows that these kind of concepts are likely to create more problems that they solve unless we're given a way to access them in a language and in a format that we understand, that we accept, that we recognize. And in many languages, vulnerability connects more directly with physical and moral weakness than just a temporary phase, a condition of vulnerability. But it is convenient in terms of research to try and measure this vulnerability. And indeed, it's absolutely crucial to recognize that we're not vulnerable to a volcano because the volcano is there. The natural hazard is there. It's going to be there. It was there before the humans arrived on the planet. And if we continue this way, it's going to be there after we are extinct from the planet. But the reality is that our vulnerability depends on the societal sphere, depends on how likely we are to be exposed to risk and to suffer to suffer injuries, to be harmed. It is dependent on the coping capacity of our society. So whether we have the hospitals, the resources, the medicines to reduce negative consequences, whether we have places to support people who have to be evacuated, whether we have water, sanitation. But also it is dependent on the societal adaptive capacity. So that ability innate in humans to adapt. One that we are forcing onto the planet, that has much slower times for adapting. And so a lot of the research in disaster risk reduction that also considers the fact that many disasters are theological. So there's an intentional harm, and many disasters that would have been called natural disasters are in fact biohuman in nature. Reminds us of the fact that these perceptions of vulnerability, these perceptions of risk, are underpinned by the enormous social diversity and cultural diversity of our species. So measuring them is useful to try to cope with them. But the ways in which we measure them doesn't necessarily mean that it's valid across the globe for all cultures to recognize risks in the same ways. So when we look at risk perception, we should be able to think that there are training elements, ideas of being prepared to deal with a risk, ideas of being able to respond to a warning and to evacuations that are not just valid universally, but they're also very specific. They are connected to ways in which we organize our social life. So for those of you who might have watched the 2019 TV series on the Chernobyl disaster, we know that there was a military-style training given to military personnel, but also an acceptance from the population to sudden evacuation within 3 hours of entire cities. Now, speaking with Russians in their 40s and their 50s, they know very well that from primary school, they were drilled on evacuation plans against conflict, but also against natural hazards. Now, in the UK, of course, we have fire evacuations from public buildings. But even those ideas, the ideas of perceiving risk and doing something, preventing the harm that the risk can do to us, are dependent on how we want to react, how we plan our reaction, so how we plan an emergency, how we put together an emergency plan, and how we recover then as a result of what we've done. And then ultimately, of course, there is the aftermath. How do we recover psychologically from the ways in which a risk, a serious risk, has put us on the spot, has asked us to change our way of living? So those are questions of risk perception. The Office of the United Nations cannot consider just the fact that all of those are linked to cultures, languages. It has to consider, of course, a global perspective, but at the same time is moved to organize them on a regional level so that action can be had to reduce the risk to the population. And at the moment, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is trying to mitigate the impact of risk across the world. And you can see that that particular idea of reducing risk is naturally and of course for the UN intrinsically connected with the idea of sustainable development, because you cannot try to improve the living conditions of the population without trying to develop their economies, their education, their infrastructures. But in developing education infrastructures and other aspects of living as we know them now, we know that we're increasing pollution. So there is an enormous tension there between continuing to pollute and depriving populations of the development that other parts of the world have seen. And the ways in which risk reduction is perceived, therefore, is and has to be the backdrop of everything that we can say about the climate crisis, our ultimate crisis. It is the Anthropocene age, and it is a crisis that we need to manage. So now you can see in Alexander's idea of how to consider the different parts that go into an emergency plan. We start by the idea of managing the disaster, so managing the immediate response, the point that something changes our way of living. And then we need to protect the civil society. So we need to have contingency plan put in place by managers that allow our societies to become more resilient. And we have to reduce the risk of disasters on the whole population. And that is when at the top, we finally need to reach the agenda of adapting our emergency plans, not the planet, our emergency plans, to the fact that maybe we've messed up with this planet and we need to act to protect ourselves from the additional risks that we created. So the disaster risk reduction Sendai framework, it is part of that integrated research area that from the 70s onwards considered the idea of studying vulnerability worldwide. Now, the problem that was put forward in very strong and beautifully crafted words by J.C. Gaillard in 2019 was the idea that maybe the paradigm of vulnerability, rather than putting everybody in egalitarian perspectives to fight against hazards, has continued existing hegemonic positions whereby the global north is in control of research data and analysis of the impact of disasters on society. And through the lack of constant, consistent, and embedded mechanisms to learn to listen to the voices of populations that deal with disasters in a different ways, it continues to be Anglo-centric and English-centric. And Alexander and Pescaroli put their attention on, even though in the so-called information age, much of the effort has been devoted to the physical mechanism of communications, but remarkably, much less attention has been given to the use of language and issues of comprehension in crisis situations. So they know that there is a gap there. There is a gap on considering how, in order to put the risk perception against the actions that need to be taken to diminish the impact and mitigate the impact of the risks, we need to communicate efficiently with everybody. We have ignored the issue of language, how to communicate. And so it has been reduced almost to a simplified dichotomy, whereby Gaillard suggests that we try to diminish the impact of disasters worldwide by applying certain formulas that we know work in the West, but we just try to apply those everywhere. And there is a cultural dimension of risk that is embedded in our cultures. And there is a notion that I want to point out in my last 5 minutes before I draw my points to an end, that the ways in which we try to prevent risks is indeed cultural. I'm going to give you a very superficial example using some of the ideas that I've presented so far. If we take Italy and Japan and we take those countries in comparison and their ways of preventing risks, we find two cultural perspectives that are completely different. So Japan is clearly more densely populated than Italy, but they have a similar hazardscape. The ways in which the different natural hazards affect the two countries is not exactly the same, but you can see here in this map of the risk that I showed you how is measured in terms of vulnerability, points out to Japan as a country with very low risk from hazards, natural hazards and other hazards, and Italy also as a country with very low risk level. But that is not because they have the same level of exposure to natural hazards in particular, because Japan, of course, as you can see, exposure to natural hazards is much higher. And it is because of tsunamis, earthquakes, because of the geological composition of Japan. And that gives us that. Italy is in the medium range, and Italy is subject to several risks caused by natural hazard. So let's take just a superficial example to show you how prevention has been linked for many years to cultural values. Here on the left, you got Vesuvio, on the right, you got Mount Fuji. They're both active volcanoes in geological terms. Vesuvio erupted last time in 1944 and Fuji in 1707. If you look at the dimension of risk, what we can see is that Japan has avoided populating 30 kilometers around Mount Fuji. Here I've used a few years ago when I was in Auckland, the maps produced by Google Map at the same scale to look at the different density of population around those two volcanoes. Now, since then, we know that actually Vesuvio is, in fact, a supervolcano, not just a volcano. But then why has the Italian authorities allowed to build to their place? Why is that? Well, you could consider that as an approach to prevention, or you can consider that as a cultural dimension of how we perceive risk. So the evacuation emergency plan, the last one for many years, was one drafted in 1984 with technologies that have been obsolete now for 2 decades already. And it was revised 2 years ago only after a long and productive action by activists, by local activists and environmental entities. In Japan, when there was the suspect of some new activities on Mount Fuji, a new evacuation plan was drafted in 2018 just 10 years after the large one was put in place in 2005, but revised every 2 years. Why is that? Because the two countries have a different approach to prevention. So the levels of risks and the vulnerabilities may be different, but culturally, Italy looks at response and being active on response. And unfortunately, because of political willingness, because of social cultural ideas of defeatism and determinism, Italy is less keen on preventing, so building in a different way, so to avoid certain risks that are avoidable. And Japan is more inclined to, as a culture, as a political culture, to act in prevention. So Italy, as a result, has one of the best, if not the best, civil protection in the world, because they're very good at picking up the pieces of the results of the injuries and the damage caused by natural hazards and otherwise. But also, here we reach the points where I have a big questions for us as translation and interpreting scholars more widely. If risk perception is clearly cultural, why do we continue to accept the situation whereby those who study the hazards that are going to affect all of us as a species continue to write on in English, and the research, the data continues to be produced in an almost entirely monolingual setting? And as Gaillard says, it's more marketable. But also we're imposing Western methodologies, and we can risk losing on methodologies that relate to the local population. When we try to impose notions, concepts that are all born out of a certain way of considering science. And it's the comparison between the global south and the global north shows that even when we're looking at two global north countries like Japan and Italy, you can have such a distinct, different, and in-depth diversity of cultural perception of risk. Imagine the variety of perceptions of risks that we have worldwide. Then we need to consider cultural differences because those influence social approaches to risk reduction. But also we need to go beyond that, and we need to challenge, especially us who are in a position of considering intercultural eco-translation ideas of communication. We need to challenge other researchers to consider the voices of those left behind, the voices of the marginalized, the voices of often the indigenous populations. And I want to close with the notion of appropriateness, with just a couple of slides that are there more for what they try to indicate, that the diglossia of access, non-access, and the paradox of using English as the language of access. So if we consider humanitarian developmental activities, and we consider that those continue to be crucial to create a more equitable, environmentally sustainable future, especially if we want to understand the risks that we face as a planet through the knowledge of everybody who live on the planet, rather than just a Western trained minority, then we need to be able to have scientific research that supports those activities. We need to be able to circulate the results of those. Sounds easy, sounds obvious. But if we don't have a lingua franca, we cannot easily circulate. But if we have a lingua franca and we don't translate into that lingua franca, which is what often happens when we collect data from resources that use rare language combinations, then we find that the lingua franca actually is an obstacle to local scientists. And imagine how research is carried out in those settings. So we have a principal investigator who's received some grants. They often work on surveys, interviews, and reporting to analyze the social dimension of the aftermath of a disaster. They carry out the survey, they possibly write it in English through the multilingual and international research team, and that particular survey, imagine, is translated into Spanish so that data can be collected in South America. But questions are then asked in Quechua by a research partner who speaks Quechua and Spanish. It's not necessarily a research assistant, it's possibly somebody just paid for a few hours to ask the question in Quechua, write down the answers in Spanish. Those answers in Spanish are then translated into English. That English is then used to organize the interviews, the follow-up interviews that the research team will carry out with the local language, almost completely ignored by these multiple translations, and the final data that is transcribed and then used in English, analyzed in English, often without that consideration, that critical consideration that the data has gone through a number of pivoting points in which translation was used. And you find a lot of the details of this kind of approach, especially in developmental settings, in the incredibly important report produced by Futsitis, Crack, Brehm, and Delgado Lucena as part of their listening zones project on the use of English in the developmental context. But it was a very interesting little debate on the Lancet 2 years ago, where Francophone researchers say that, especially for public health and for medical research, French should be used as another language to present information. And Camadieu, who is the editor of a Pan-African publication of medical research, uses the killer argument, saying, does it make sense, however, to cry for the inclusion of French in global health research? What about the exclusion of Portuguese, Arabic, and any of the estimated 7,000 other languages spoken today? And his answer that comes from somebody who actually is the chief editor of a bilingual journal, publishes in English and French, supporting African researchers in medicine, says that translating every piece of good research in all possible written languages is not possible and is not feasible. We accept that point. And moving to English-speaking Africa opened my eyes to the immense inequities in the access to training, scholarship, sponsorship, and funding opportunities between people in the Francophone and the Anglophone parts of Africa. Policymakers should mandate that the languages of education are decided by the need to promote equitable access to information, knowledge, and skills. So appropriate translation is appropriate to getting real consent, not achieving consensus by means of putting everything back into a regional lingua franca. But the fact that still in 2020, researchers for the International Review of the Red Cross have to still point out that when we look for carrying out research in a humanitarian context, we need to ensure that people are giving real consent and not just asked a poor translation of a consent form, an incredibly complicated consent form written in English, means that we got a long way to go. And this is where I want to finish. In translation and interpreting, we have an important role to play in terms of risk communication. Translation, interpreting, signing, and all multimodal forms of accessibility are crucial when we look at what we can do to reduce the impact of climate change in the immediate future and to better understand how the changes in climates are affecting populations worldwide. And we need to look at ways in which decolonizing research methods could rely on interpreting and translation as crucial pivoting moments for changing the Western paradigm. It is not just idealistic. I think it's something that has to happen because the world is occupied by a plural number of voices, and we tend to listen only to those that speak in a language, and often very few languages that we understand and we want to listen to. But at the same time, if we don't translate into English and we don't translate out of English for populations that are locally affected by major disasters, we're leaving them out of data and facts that are crucial. Just like now, we're leaving them out of access to inoculations and vaccines. And it's not them and us. I use them just as a pronoun here. But it is a question of us and us. The world is one, the human species is one. Every global vulnerability now is a vulnerability for everybody, every citizen in the world. And yes, the rich have got different ways to protect themselves from the poor and everybody else in the population. But at the same time, if we want to act, it's the time to act. And I think that translation in and out of local languages is key to participation and community-led projects that increase social resilience. And we need to play that role. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. What a wonderful talk and a wonderful way into our conference and our various conference themes. Yes, I was thinking as you were talking earlier on about safety and security and making a very fine distinction there. I mean, that's another pair of words, isn't it, which are collapsed in, the distinction is collapsed in so many languages. When you were talking at the very end as well about seeking informed data consent, I was reminded of the work of my colleague Joe Drugan at UEA, who's been looking particularly at those questions in the healthcare setting, which is very analogous. We have just under 10 minutes altogether for questions, and a number of questions have started coming through in the Q&A. So let's kick off then with a question from an anonymous attendee who asks this: in terms of rare language combinations for translation in regions highly prone to disasters, this seems to be a pedagogical issue as well for translation studies as a discipline, since many programs are language specific or combination specific, such as UN official language focused. How are we as translation practice educators to update our pedagogies and curricula to support and train current and future translators to actively work with rare language combinations?
I love that. It's the million-dollar question. And so some colleagues in the question and answer have already said that interactors try to work in that area, work in the idea of training. It is a particularly controversial area as well, because we're talking about translating hazards, translating risks, and we're talking about the ethical danger of training quickly people that might be bilingual, but who have only limited proficiency in their own languages, in writing, for instance, or they have zero proficiency in translation and interpreting terms. But it is a true pedagogical challenge, because curricula, and I was attending the African Forum for the Professionalization of Translation and Interpreting in the continent, and the curricula that are most successful in the African continent are those that include the usual languages, are those that include colonial languages. So we need to look at decolonizing the curriculum, but also we need to look at making sure that those that are considered endangered languages are protected. And that protection is not something that needs to be top down. It's something that is perceived often quite actively by local players. And that would have been my illustration if I was good with timing. It's a project that we're now currently doing in Sierra Leone, where we were contacted by personnel of the YMCA in Sierra Leone that was working with crisis managers who are mainly bilingual and speak 5 of the most widely used languages there. And we're trying to work in collaboration with Fura Bay College to ensure that that college that trains linguists at a very high level consider also training translators, not just linguists, as in scholars of linguistics and applied linguistics, but also translators, not with the purpose just of protecting endangered languages. That is a very nice final outcome, but also with the purpose of supporting communication about natural hazards. And this project started simply as being involved as crisis translator trainers to provide a linkage there between multilingual communities that want to be informed and multilingual communities that want to continue to use their languages. So that is a very long answer, because this is an incredibly complex project. This is an incredibly complex challenge for us. But translation and interpreting can play a huge role there if we identify curricula that can be supported, if we restore the understanding that beyond the commercial sector, there's many other forms of translation that are needed, necessary, and therefore even potentially the commercial sector might find it interesting. I'm not always against industry per se. I'm against corporations and monopolies.
Thanks, Federico. You mentioned Janice Lee, and who has put a link in the in the chat to interact and makes reference to that in a Q&A comment, interact with collaborations from University of Auckland Translation Studies and New Zealand Red Cross available on YouTube. Courses have training manuals available. So do follow the link in the chat. Enrica Ferrara asks, are all official documents related to disasters written in English? Are there not local policies and regulations that might not be translated into English and could be at odds with official regulations? Could it be a case that there is an issue linked to lack of porosity and availability of translation between local and official documents written in different languages?
Yes, to both. So a lot of the official documents of supranational entities tend to be written in English, and then those of the UN tend to be translated then in the other 6 official languages. There are, of course, then regional offices for UN entities that may offer additional translations in significantly important languages in the geographical areas. However, the problem is that that is always a risk of having porosity from top down. So information that is disseminated, given, at best shared. But how do we create that resource of information that also takes into account the local official documents written in other languages that may be the result of community-driven activities to increase risk preparedness? And of course, I'm not under the naive impression that we can have a global risk reduction single emergency plan, trying to answer to another important question together with the ones by Ferrara and by JT Hom. And I think that these are they're 2 parts of the same question. Local documents need to reflect community-driven practices of risk reductions and the needs of the local communities. But for that reason, they should be translated into English or other languages that inform global and international ideas about risk reduction and about planning towards emergencies, because then we have that plurality, that diversity of voices that better prepares us as a world that is globally interconnected and at risk of global pandemics and other global events to understand the different points of view. It doesn't mean that it resolves conflict or that mediates the different political tensions and commercial tensions, but at least allows us to understand that the same risk can be dealt with in a different way. And also there is that issue that there are many Englishes. If you don't mind me, Duncan, I go into the next question because it naturally follows from that. It is true, there is multiple Englishes and there's multiple collocations for Englishes. So what we find in the supranational English of the United Nations is one of the versions of Englishes that could be used. And it is also very true that a term like lockdown is a translation problem when it appears to be transparent in one form of international English and completely unintelligible in other forms of English. But why? Is that a problem with English? No, I think that goes back to the risk perception. The idea to have a lockdown to avoid further risks and protect our safety with that approach relates to a certain way of thinking that may be Anglo-American, as in UK, Australia, and Canada and the United States, excluding in part New Zealand, excluding Australia and New Zealand because they have slightly different ways of dealing with emergencies. But the idea of lockdown could be closer to that English because it's closer to that perception of risk. But I'm not willing to simplify here, but I think that English and Englishes should have helped us to find something better to talk about physical distancing ourselves during the COVID-19 months of lockdown, because we didn't need to socially distance ourselves, we needed to physically distance ourselves. There was the physical element that mattered, not the disconnection with the rest of society. We were in fact doing that in the interest of everybody else. Now that mistranslation to me is an indication of how English as an international language can be useful to share data, but also can cause, just like lockdown, a huge amount of other problems when it simplifies complexity.
Federico, thank you so much for your paper and for your generous answers to these questions.